This lecture is going to get you through Chapter 22, the respiratory system. First thing to talk about is what is gas exchange. So gas exchange for human beings means oxygen is going to be going into your body so that it can get to your tissues so that your tissues can carry out cellular respiration. And then as we produce carbon dioxide during cellular respiration, that CO2 needs to leave your body because it's not great to have a bunch of it stored inside of your body. And so it's oxygen in, carbon dioxide out. Gas exchange occurs in two separate places. It happens in the lungs in what's known as external respiration, and then it happens at the tissues, between the tissues and the blood, and that's called internal respiration. And all of this process is going to be relying on diffusion. So remember that diffusion is movement of a solute, like oxygen, from an area of high concentration to an area of lower concentration. Next up, there's different kinds of respiratory systems that you can find in the animal kingdom. Aquatic animals tend to have gills. What happens in the gills is we've got capillaries that are really close to all of these little fleshy appendages, and then these exist usually in fish behind this operculum, and they can beat the operculum to move water over it, and then that water is going to have dissolved oxygen in it, and so oxygen is going to diffuse into the capillaries that are in those little appendages, and then carbon dioxide is going to diffuse out into the water. And so the key to this is it must be in an aquatic system in order for gills to work. If they're not in an aquatic system, they tend to collapse on themselves, and then they don't do gas exchange very well. So you're going to find gills in aquatic critters. Next up, tracheal system or tracheal tubes. You're going to find this in some terrestrial insects that have decoupled the circulatory system from the respiratory system. So for you guys, your circulatory system is what's going to transport your respiratory gases around in your body, and so they have to work very closely together, your circulatory system and respiratory system. But here they don't. And so what happens is these insects, and it's usually going to be insects, they have these little openings along the side of their body that are called spiracles, and they don't just have one opening, they have lots of little openings. The spiracles lead to these branching tubes, and those tubes branch and end next to pretty much every single cell in the body, and so we've got atmospheric air taking oxygen-rich gases right next to every cell in the body, and so that's why we don't need the circulatory system to help. It's because this system takes the oxygen directly to the cells. Then there's how we do it, and how pretty much all terrestrial animals, birds, reptiles are going to try to do this. The lungs contain the respiratory membrane, so we've got the alveoli of the lungs. The alveoli are these little air sacs, and so we have air inside of these sacs, and then we have capillaries that surround the sacs, and so the oxygen is going to diffuse out of the sac into the bloodstream, and CO2 out of the bloodstream and into the sac. And so all of these little bubbles are what constitute our lungs, and our lungs are doing our gas exchange for us. After that, I gave you, it doesn't want to click, there we go. I gave you this picture to label. Remember, you can pause it at any point so that you can make sure you get your labels. This is your anatomy of the respiratory system. So the nostrils are also called the nares. They take the air into the nasal cavities. We've got all of these little turbinates that help to create turbulent airflow within the nasal cavity so that the air essentially kind of bounces around the nose and drops off any particulate matter like smoke or dust or pollen, so that those things don't make it down deeper into the lungs. The nose also helps to warm and moisten the air, because I don't know if you've ever taken a deep breath of cold, dry air. Your lungs don't like that. And so your nose doesn't just provide a passageway for air, it also filters, warms, and moistens that air. Then we go to the pharynx, which is what most people call the throat. The pharynx has a fair number of tonsils in it that are going to catch pathogens that are floating around in that air and then help filter that pathogenic material out of it. Then here's part of our problem. We've got both the digestive system and the respiratory system sharing a portion of the pharynx. So we have to have a way to make sure that the food that we eat or the drinks that we drink don't make it into the respiratory system. So whenever you swallow food or drink, the epiglottis pulls down so that it covers up the opening to the larynx, which leads to the trachea. This little area right here is the larynx. Your vocal cords are in there. That way, when this is closed, your food or drink goes down the esophagus, which is going to take us to the stomach eventually. When you're breathing, the epiglottis points upwards and the larynx is open so that you can breathe into your larynx and then your trachea. Your trachea splits into bronchi. There's a bronchus for each lung. And then the tube keeps splitting over and over and over again. Eventually, you end up at these really teeny tiny tubes that are called terminal bronchioles. The terminal bronchioles lead to all these little air sacs. Each individual air sac is one alveolus or alveolus. I don't care which way you want to say that. These are surrounded by capillaries, and this is where the gas exchange, the extra respiration part of gas exchange, is actually going to happen. You can kind of think of an alveolar sac like it's a cluster of grapes. Each grape is an alveolus, and the cluster is called an alveolar sac. The diaphragm is what separates the thoracic cavity from the abdominopelvic cavity. This is also going to be your prime mover for inspiration. So when you breathe in, this muscle contracts and pulls down. That increases the volume in the thoracic cage so that you decrease the pressure, and then you suck air in as a result of that muscle contraction. All right, getting some of this jazz in the notes. So one of the things that you guys are missing out on, since lab is not happening anymore, at least not lab on campus with dissections, is you don't get to actually dissect your fetal pig or your rat or anything like that. But right above the liver, there's this sheet of muscle, and you can see part of it. This group of students butchered it, but that is part of the diaphragm. It had gone all the way across here. And so that diaphragm, again, is your prime mover for inspiration. When it contracts, you breathe in. Pharynx is your throat. It's part of the airway. It's also part of the digestive system. Larynx is the vocal box because you have vocal cords in there. They vibrate to produce the sounds necessary for speech. This just shows you what your vocal cords actually do when you're doing the movements necessary for speech. So notice that they vibrate, and that vibration creates the sound waves that are necessary for speech. Trachea is the windpipe. So it's really just an airway for breathing. It ends right here where it splits into your bronchi, and it starts just under the cricoid cartilage. This part up here that this picture has labeled trachea, this is actually part of the larynx. So this is larynx, and then from here to here is your trachea. Your bronchi split off the bottom of the trachea, and again, there's one of those for each lung. Your bronchioles are the small tubes that lead to the alveolar sacs, which lead, of course, to the individual alveoli. The alveoli are where gas exchange is going to happen. This shows you the capillary network that's on the surface. So again, lots of capillaries on that surface so that we can do gas exchange, so that we can get oxygen onto the red blood cells in those capillaries and then unload CO2 from the capillaries. COPD is chronic obstructive pulmonary disease. You guys already have all the stuff. The red word fills in the blank that you need here. This is why you should not be smoking. If you do smoke, you are damaging not just your lungs, but also your airway. And so you make it much more difficult for you to breathe. You increase the workload for breathing so that just breathing exhausts you during the course of the day. And then because you've also damaged the airway, you usually have to cough to try to clear mucus out of the lungs. How does smoking damage? The red words again are what are going to fill in your blanks here. So this shows you nice normal cow lung. This shows you lungs that have not, it goes too fast for me, sorry. Lungs that don't have lung compliance anymore. Notice this one's not even expanding anymore. So this is what healthy lungs should do. When they are expandable like that and they shrink back down after you've blown air in, they are what's known as compliant. It just means that they're nice and elastic. And the one with emphysema, it just doesn't have that anymore. Lung cancer, while the risk for this increases if you smoke, there are genetic components to this, so it's very important that you understand that there are people out there who get lung cancer that have never smoked a day in their life, and that's because of that genetic risk factor. There's also an air pollution contributor to this, and so people who live in places that have really dirty air, or like coal miners, they are more likely to get lung cancer as well. Breathing is just, it's also called ventilation. It's getting air in, it's getting air out of the lungs. You have to breathe so you can carry out gas exchange, and so this is just filling and unfilling the lungs. You already have your little blurb for negative pressure breathing. All right, hopefully you can kind of see what I want to show you here, but you can see the diaphragm that would be sitting right off under here. To help him breathe in, the diaphragm actually pulls down so that you can create a negative pressure environment in the chest so that air fills your lungs as a result of that downward contraction. So that's negative pressure breathing because you suck air in. There are animals like frogs do positive pressure breathing where they force air down, but that's not how we work. This just shows you the way the muscles contract to help you breathe in and then breathe out. Now normally exhalation or expiration, this is a passive process. You just relax the muscles that you contracted earlier, and that's going to help you push the air out because your lungs are compliant. Next up, vital capacity. This is something that I usually have you guys test in class. And of course we're not in class, and I can't exactly have you breathe into a bag that I have with me because you're not here with me. So I have created an additional video where I do the activities that I would have normally done with you guys, so you can at least see how it works, and vital capacity is part of that video. Watch that video because I also give you the data that you're going to need to complete the assignment for the respiratory system. To measure your vital capacity, what you do is you take a big deep breath in and then you blow out as much air as you possibly can. Now, vital capacity is not the same thing as total lung capacity, and that's because there's a certain amount of air that you have to keep in the lungs just to keep your lungs from collapsing. So vital capacity is just the amount of air that you can exchange with the outside world. Again, you guys are going to get your data from the video that I showed you. I did go ahead and give you average for college-age students right here, just so you could see how the students that I've had in the past that test this plus me compare to the values that we have going on right there. Alright, back to the book. Where are the breathing control centers located? They're in the medulla oblongata is the full name. It's the very inferior most portion of our brain just above the spinal cord. What's the primary stimulus for breathing? This goes against what most of my students think. Everybody thinks you breathe so you can get oxygen in, but really the oxygen is like a tertiary control measure for your breathing. The reason that you breathe, the reason your medulla stimulates your diaphragm so you can breathe, is so that you can flush excess CO2 out of your system. CO2 has a couple of different problems going on for it. Not only is it a waste product that has to be removed, when it mixes with the water and your plasma, it creates carbonic acid, so it drops your blood's pH. So not only is your body measuring CO2 levels, it's also measuring pH. That's two measures that are all about carbon dioxide that help control your respiratory rate. Oxygen comes after those other two. So you breathe in, yes, you will get oxygen in, but you breathe in so you can eventually breathe out so you can flush that CO2 out of your system. Let's see, this picture is trying to show you the direction your different gases are moving. They are moving on their own in opposite directions based on something called partial pressure gradients. So what's going to happen is there's more oxygen outside of you than inside, so oxygen is going to move in eventually to the air spaces. There's more oxygen in the alveoli than there is in the capillary bed, so oxygen is going to diffuse from the airspace into the capillary bed. It's going to get transported through the circulatory system, and then there's less oxygen in the tissue cells because they're constantly using that oxygen, and so oxygen is going to diffuse out of the capillaries and into tissue cells. CO2, exact opposite. We constantly produce it in our tissue cells during cellular respiration, so there's more CO2 in your tissues than anywhere else out here. So we're going to diffuse into the bloodstream. Bloodstream's going to transport it back to the lungs. We're going to diffuse out of the capillaries and into the alveoli and then out of the body, following its own partial pressure gradient. How is oxygen getting transported? The red is what you need for this. So this is a molecule of hemoglobin. Each red blood cell contains about 1 million molecules of hemoglobin. And then each hemoglobin can carry 4 molecules of oxygen attached to these little structures that are called heme groups. There's an iron atom in the middle of the heme group, and so the oxygen is going to attach to the iron. That's why you need iron in your diet, is so you can transport this oxygen. So the hemoglobin that I was describing just a second ago, this is just what it is. It is genetically determined. There are people out there whose genes tell them how to make bad hemoglobin, so they get sickle cell anemia. But it contains that iron that we're going to be binding to. Carbonic acid. It's H2CO3. Now, I mentioned earlier, when carbon dioxide mixes with the water in your blood plasma, it creates carbonic acid. Remember that acids have a pH less than 7, so when you accumulate too much CO2, like let's say you hold your breath for a long time, you start to drop your blood's pH because you generate more of this carbonic acid. Now, carbonic acid is not a very stable molecule, so it tends to dissociate into hydrogen ion and bicarbonate ion. So bicarb is what you're defining next. It's HCO3 and it is a negative ion. This helps you buffer against those pH changes, but it can only do so much work. So eventually you do have to breathe out so that you can get rid of that carbonic acid so you can get your pH back up to where it's supposed to be. Now, another little quirk. Whenever a woman is pregnant with a child, if the child had the same hemoglobin as mom, the baby wouldn't be able to strip oxygen off mom's hemoglobin. So the baby actually makes their own hemoglobin that is different from mom's, that has a stronger affinity for oxygen, so that as mom's blood gets pumped through the placenta, the baby's hemoglobin actually steals mom's oxygen so that the baby can get oxygenated while down there. Now, I mentioned sickle cell anemia just a second ago. One of the newer treatment options for that is to reactivate fetal hemoglobin, because people with sickle cell anemia, their adult hemoglobin is what's broken. Their fetal hemoglobin still works just fine. And so if we can turn that gene back on, they can actually transport oxygen exactly like they were supposed to. So what you guys are going to do for the assignment for this chapter is, I've posted a respiratory quiz in there. In the assignments in Schoology, and I posted a video that you have to watch so that you can complete this assignment. You're going to do the breath holding exercise that I described to you in that video, and then you're going to graph your results on the TARP part of this. And then in that video, I give you data for forced vital capacity based on past student responses, plus what I blow as I make the video. Then you've got a couple of multiple choice questions. Once you have that completed, you're going to upload that into Schoology so that I can get that graded. That's going to be due by Thursday, April 9th at midnight.